So we will start with a little bit of, some background discussion, making sure that we're kind of all on the same page in terms of what happened where and how it happened in terms of time, and some of the general causes of the overall Arab Spring, this crazy phenomenon that we're calling the Arab Spring. But then we're going to go through a couple of the individual countries and take a look at them, trying to focus primarily on Egypt and Syria, because they seem to be the two most conflictual right now. It seems to have the most going on, things that are likely that you'll be having discussions about. So how many of you are reasonably familiar with what's been going on over the past couple of years in the Middle East? Hopefully everybody reading the news. It's kind of hard, if you paid attention to the news at all, it's kind of hard to have avoided these issues because they've been right there front and center. And it's a pretty big deal because this is a part of the world that we all know is pretty important, right, for a variety of different reasons. And it's in turmoil right now. There's all kinds of things going on. These are some historical shifts going on right now during our lifetime, right? So some pretty substantial stuff happening. This is very much about, people power in the Middle East. This is a part of the world that doesn't have an awful lot of experience, historical experience, with this thing that in the West we call democracy. I mean, democracy can be an awful lot of different things, right? And it can mean a different thing in each country or each region. This is a part of the world that has an odd relationship with this development of this democratic ideal, this democratic promise. But it certainly has a long history of people standing up for themselves. It has a long history of people, fighting for what they think is right, whether that's a violent fight or a nonviolent fight. Okay, so certainly there's been this struggle that's been going on for quite some time. It's kind of interesting that if you look at the flags of the nations in the Middle East, you see a lot of similarities, right? You see an awful lot of similarities. You see a lot of the same colors, red, white, black, and green. There are a couple of crazy outliers like Somalia, but Somalia kind of is an outlier anyway. Qatar and Bahrain have almost essentially the exact same flag, but for tone or color. So a lot of the colors are roughly the same, and a lot of that has to do with the Islamic influence in the region. Heavily dominated by Islamic influences and the Islamic nature, and those are Islamic colors. These countries are not so different from one another in certain ways. Okay, in certain ways there are similarities that run through a variety of different places here. So the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is something that it's a term that we've used for the last couple of years to describe this groundswell of change, democratic change, or popular protest demonstrations, revolutionary demonstrations happening across the Middle East. And also the Middle East itself is very difficult nomenclature. It's a weird term to talk about the Middle East. Some would say the Far East, some would say the Near East, some would say don't call it that at all, call it by its individual country name. Some would call it the Arab world, some would call it, no term is probably going to be perfect in this situation. But the Arab Spring is also an interesting term. It's been called the Arab Spring, it's been called the Jasmine Revolution, it's been called a lot of different things. The Arab Spring is a term that was created, I think, by a foreign policy, Foreign Policy Journal. A writer for foreign policy used that term, and it's been kind of taken on, and he didn't use it intentionally, but others have said it was actually a term that has been used by Western interests in order to undermine the elite power structure within these Middle Eastern nations. There are so many accusations and counter-accusations that have gone back and forth in every single one of these conflicts. It's kind of hard to keep track of. It's almost like a geopolitical soap opera. It's very difficult to keep track of what's actually valid and what's not. So there have been a variety of different things that have happened, everything from full-on revolutions and civil wars to, just some minor protests that you might even see happening like around here, right? Protests in the United States is very different than it is in other parts of the world. In case, that was, not known to you. Protests here, people write a letter to their congressman or congresswoman, or they go down and they stand at the public building and say, no war, peace, right? And that's about the extent of, a lot of protests in this country. In these countries, protests are a little bit different. Each individual neighborhood has got stacks of burning tires in order to create a barricade from people getting into their their neighborhood, and people are, prepared when they go out for tear gas at almost all times. And it's a little bit different situation where, people are, finding bulldozers so that they can ram the gates of Parliament and stuff like that. It's a little bit different situation. So we have revolutions taking place in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. When we talk about revolution, we're meaning, regime change. The revolution was largely successful in terms of getting rid of the powers that were in charge, got rid of the regime. It's questionable whether or not Yemen should apply in that top category of revolutions, because the president of Yemen was deposed. He was put out of power, but it wasn't really what I would call regime change in Yemen. It's essentially still the same group of folks in charge, despite the fact that the head honcho has, left power. Civil wars, full-blown civil wars in Syria and Yemen. I put Mali in parentheses because Mali's not really an Arab country, despite the fact that the conflict in Mali is very much about Arab-African conflict. And a big part of the conflict and the civil war in Mali was fallout from the civil war in Libya. One of the reasons the conflict in Mali got so significant was that the Tuareg rebels were able to get their hands on a whole bunch of weaponry that flooded out of Libya following the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, because he had a fairly well-equipped military, and when the pro-Gaddafi folks lost a lot of, and they were looking for funds or they were looking for places to hide, a lot of their weaponry went south into some of these other Central African nations because they were looking for hard currency. In addition, during the Libyan conflict, Muammar Gaddafi was hiring mercenaries from these other African countries, and a lot of them were Tuareg rebels, and so they were getting funding, they were getting weaponry, etc. So not really, strictly an Arab Spring issue, but certainly caught up in all of that. Military coups, we'll talk about whether that's a coup in Egypt. Civil uprisings taking place in Yemen and Egypt. At the same time I have Yemen in the civil war. That's because there are about 5 or 6 different distinct conflicts going on in Yemen all at the same time, so it fits in multiple categories. Egypt probably fits in multiple categories. You have major protests happening all over the Middle East. It wasn't just the ones that we read about on the news. There were also, in 2011 in Algeria, they said there was something like 700 notable protests taking place in Algeria. Algeria is a pretty unstable kind of place for that kind of activity. Lots of things happening in all these different countries, minor protests happening. So a wide range of different events taking place across the Middle Eastern world. It's not just what's been going on in Syria. It's not just what's been happening in Egypt. It is things that are happening in a variety of different countries all over that region. So to give you a kind of a more graphic visual of that, you can kind of see that different things have been happening, different places. I probably need to update this for a couple of them, but for instance, like I mentioned, Yemen, it's hard to categorize what has happened there because so many different things are happening there. It's difficult to put it into one particular category. Likewise, Egypt is kind of going back and forth. There are revolutions and counter-revolutions and coups and all kinds of stuff happening all the time. And so all of these, not all these situations, but several of these countries, it's a very fluid and dynamic situation. It's changing pretty regularly. How many of you see the news, the big news this morning out of Egypt? We were talking about in our debate room down the hall just a minute ago. The government of Egypt, or the judicial branch of Egypt, has just announced that Hosni Mubarak is free to go. All right, free to go. Next couple of days could be crazy, even though they've already been crazy in Egypt. That's a pretty big deal. So, stuff happening all the time. It's hard to keep track of. During the debate season, when you're debating this stuff, these are issues that you probably have to just put on your weekly reading list of saying, well, I got to read 2 or 3 articles about Syria and Egypt this week. In other words, you're going to be months behind on what's actually happening in that particular area. So, also it's important to note that these protests that are happening are not just happening in the Arab world. Okay, you have this little sliver of land right down here, Israel. Israel has even seen significant public demonstrations and protests over the past year or so. A lot of theirs has been based on economic reform, political reform, questions over who has to serve in the military and who doesn't. A lot of that kind of stuff, but still significant. Iran has seen significant protests over the past several years, particularly when Ahmadinejad was elected the last time, and there were big, eruption of demonstration. Turkey, we all know about what's been going on in Istanbul over the course of the past 5-6 months, right? So big conflicts happening there, or big protests happening there, but also several of these African nations, things happening as well. So, now let's jump back a little bit and do a little bit of history so that we understand a little bit about why some of these things are happening. As we talked about yesterday, the spread of Islam happens very, very, very quickly. Right? It comes out of the Arabian Peninsula and it starts moving all over the place very rapidly. But not only does it move rapidly, but then once it has taken these lands, it holds these lands. And to say that Islam holds them is kind of weird because different empires do it, but they're Islamic empires. It has the largest amount of influence over these lands for the next several hundred years, like the next 1,500 years. Right? So heavily, heavily, heavily dominant in every single day aspect of most people's lives. Okay, so very, very prominent in this area. I want for us to take a quick look at the Ottoman Empire as well. We talked a little bit yesterday about the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is important for a couple of reasons, because not only is it an Islamic empire, but it is also an empire that is able to establish its rule and influence over virtually all of the population. Really, you could say that, well, they also controlled all of this, but that nobody really lives out here much except for a few Bedouin tribes that are nomadic tribes wandering through the desert. But all the populated areas in this whole region is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. That means it's huge. Okay, we're going to take a look at a graphic in just a moment to kind of compare it to some of the others at that time. But not only is it huge, but it is Islamic, and it creates dominant presence in all these places. We talked about yesterday as well that when you're an empire, a colonial power, do you want the countries or the areas that you control to have strong militaries? Not really. Do you want them to even be politically strong? Not really. Do you want them to even be culturally strong or economically strong? Not really. Because if they're too strong in any of those individual ways, they can challenge your rule. They can challenge your ability to conduct business there, to take taxes, to impose your way of government, your way of life, etc. Even though the Ottoman, by historical standards, were reasonably benign rulers, they're still rulers, right? And you still have to go along to get along with the imperial power. So the Ottoman have an awful lot of control in this area, which means that civil society, institutions within a country or within these different regions, they still like to maintain some, self-identity, some autonomy in certain ways, but they didn't have the ability to develop their own civil institutions. They were, relied upon the institution of the state, which was the Ottoman state. Which means that when the Ottomans went away several hundred years later, those countries didn't really have democratic institutions. They didn't really have civil society. All of a sudden it was, well, shit, the empire disappeared. Now what do? Nobody really knows how to run the place, which is the problem we saw in Iraq. Right? In Iraq, the United States goes in, we kick out Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party, and we pass the anti-Baathification laws that say no Ba'ath Party leaders or even Ba'ath Party members can run government institutions. Guess what? For the previous 30 years, no one else had run a government institution, and all of a sudden we have a situation where none of the ministries, none of the departments, none of the bureaucracies have people running them that have ever run anything like that before. It's kind of hard to run a country, right? Particularly a country that's still embroiled in civil war, and all of a sudden you take all the people that knew how to do it and say, you can't do it anymore, you're not allowed, and which means, you have government ministers that now don't have a job and don't know what to do, so they rely on, rebellion. And you put a whole bunch of people that haven't had those kind of jobs in charge, and either they kind of mess it up or they don't really know how to do it, right? And the same kind of thing is happening in this region across the board because they don't really have that historical development of democratic institution. So, the next graphic is going to be an animated map that will show you the growth of the Ottoman Empire. I want you to pay attention to two things. First is how quickly it grew, over that period. But secondarily, I want you to think in mind and superimpose your own map up here to counterbalance or juxtapose the growth of the Ottoman Empire to what you would think about the growth of the European empires. So as you're watching that, think about, gee, how big was Spain during that time? How big was England during that time? How big was the French Empire during that time? Because the Ottomans were just bigger, right? Bigger, better, smarter, faster, stronger Olympians. Okay? So check out how quick, it's not super fast, but check out how quickly this grows. Start slow, and then boom, clear into Europe, all of Egypt. And by this time, Columbus has set sail. By this time, we're almost looking at American Revolution. Right? That's huge. That is a major, major chunk of real estate. Egypt kind of goes away and then comes back. Right? There's a little bit of political maneuvering that goes on inside the empire. Then it comes back. And then all of a sudden, toward the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire gets sick. Right? It's overextended. Right? And all of a sudden, it starts collapsing in on itself. And the European powers rise up over the course of those 200, 300, 400 years and are better able to challenge the Ottoman Empire, so that when we come around World War I, the French and the British gang up and say, the Ottomans are weak. The Ottomans are weak and prime for the picking. Let's go in, let's knock them off, and we'll divide and split up the spoils. Right? So a lot happening in terms of the historical development in this region. So back to the Arab Spring. Some general causes or motivations for these uprisings. There are political motivations. These are generally oppressive countries in terms of at least the government structure. Not a lot of democratic development and political freedoms. And a lot of these protests began really just as simple calls for reform. We'd like things to be a little bit better. We're, tired of how oppressive it is. We'd like a little bit of a change. A lot of it was economic. There's a lot of widespread poverty. And a lot of it is based in this right here. Some of these countries are doing well. Saudi Arabia is doing well. Right? Egypt has a fair amount of cash coming in, that kind of stuff. But there's huge wealth disparity. The rich-poor gap in these countries is tremendous. Kind of similar to the United States of America. Huge wealth gap. It's just that the differences in the amount of wealth are substantially different between the two. You also have government corruption in a lot of them. Nepotism, sectarianism, they only promote their own people. That was part of the colonial legacy. When the European colonial powers came in, they picked a small elite group that they set up as the leader of the region. They gave them favors, right? And that was often a small ethnic or sectarian group that was different than some of the other people. And once the colonialists left, they maintained that rule through nepotism, right? By giving their family members or tribal members all of the top positions and made them generals and colonels and stuff like that. This is a pretty big, these two kind of together. This, that doesn't say intergenerational, it says international. Intergenerational conflict between the disaffected youth and the older generations. And part of that is this, right? The younger generations in these Arab countries have suddenly gained access to the internet. They're watching television. And all of a sudden on the internet and on television, they're seeing Western life and European life. And it's all of a sudden, it's like, wow, that's a little bit different. Why don't we get access to some of the same stuff? Why can't we speak our minds? Why can't we, be full participants in the government structure? Why? And all of a sudden, in addition, at the same time, there's horrifically high levels of youth unemployment. Right? If you're under 25 in most of these countries, you don't have a job. Not because you don't want one, but because there's not one for you. Right? So there are lots of these kind of intermixing issues going on. In addition to, as we've talked about before, the ethnic, the religious, and the generational differences within each of these countries and across the region as a whole. Okay, so a lot of different factors working together to create this motivation for change. We'll take a look at a couple of them. Freedom House is an organization that determines the freedom of the press in countries around the world, and they have varying ways that they measure that. You can see that this is a region of the world that doesn't do so well in terms of its political and media and, what we would term, freedom of expression. Right? There's not a lot of, they're down in the bad column in most of these places. So a lot of political oppression. There are a couple of countries that squeak through. Food insecurity is also a pretty big deal. When you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, you get maybe a little bit desperate. And you also start doing things to, create change. To change that situation for yourself, for your family, for your broader society. So food insecurity is a big deal across all of this region. Right? It's also fairly arid, so they rely on importing a lot of food items and food products. So again, a lot of general poverty conditions in a lot of these situations. So what kind of techniques and methods did they use? A lot of different things. Your typical stuff that you might find anywhere, marches and rallies and demonstrations and sit-ins, that kind of stuff that you'd see maybe anywhere around the world. You also saw the rise of social media, Twitter. Some people have called this the Twitter revolution, right? Because online media has made it possible for a lot of things. It allows for you to, well, you're all probably involved in Facebook in one form or another, and I'm not, so I don't know exactly how this works, but you can send out an announcement, right? You can say, hey, there's this thing happening, and within, half an hour, the whole freaking world knows about it, right? Because it's the networking that takes place, and that information goes out. Not only does this allow for quick and rapid dissemination of information, but it also allows for the quick and rapid dissemination of information in a way that people are not afraid they're going to be put in prison immediately for. If someone's out on the corner handing out leaflets, the police can come up and arrest that person and take them away. But you can, from the comfort of your own home or from some private place, you can send out a Twitter feed or, hashtag Let's Go Rebel down at Tahrir Square, and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people know about it without you really being in immediate and direct danger. And so this has a pretty significant effect because it bypasses the traditional mechanisms of power and control that the state has in these places, because all of these states have pretty strong security apparati. Is that a word? Apparati? Sure. We'll make it a word. Right? We'll add it to the lexicon of... they all have a pretty strong security system set up, and so the people have to find ways to get around that. There are also major strikes that take place. If all of the transportation workers in Cairo get together one day and say, screw it, we're not going to drive cabs today, all of a sudden people have to stop and pay attention because there's no way to get around. Right? And so when you have general strikes called for in a lot of these countries, people take notice. There are strikes that happen in this country too, and people don't even really pay attention to it. It doesn't happen, doesn't notice, unless it affects you immediately and directly. But in these places, you can have a strike that affects a lot of people very quickly, and people will take up notice. There were also riots and clashes with security forces. People picked up stones. They picked up sticks. They started throwing firebombs and Molotov cocktails. Right? And so things got a little bit more intense and heated in a variety of places. Some places they went to full armed insurrection, rebellion. They picked up arms and they fortified their positions and they formed, battalions and they trained people, etc. In some places you have the creation of opposition councils. You have to remember that in a lot of these countries, because we're talking about decades of oppression, that in a lot of these countries you have an elite class, some of which have left the country, the intelligentsia, whether that's researchers, scholars, artists, political leaders, etc., that have left the country because if they stay in the country, they're going to be in prison. And so you have leaders that are off in other places. A good example, Ayatollah Khomeini, right? The leader of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. He wasn't even in Iran. Right? He was kind of bouncing around between Paris and London for 15 years or something, directing from the outside. And so in Syria, the same kind of thing is happening. We have an opposition council that is made up of Syrians that haven't even been in Syria for probably the last 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And so a lot of people in Syria are saying, what do you know about this situation? You've been living the life of luxury off in, Istanbul or Paris or Rome or wherever for the last 20 years. We're the ones that are here living, dying, and breathing this conflict, so we don't really respect your authority. Right? So there are lots of tensions that come out there. Also, just because an opposition council is formed doesn't mean that everybody in that opposition council agrees with each other and gets along. Okay? And sometimes you see foreign intervention coming into play where outside countries get involved, either for good reasons or nefarious reasons, and whether something is a good reason or a bad reason probably depends on your perspective. Right? We'll talk about a couple of those. So a variety of different responses and methods of approach. So what was the reaction by the governments in these areas? Well, again, just as there was a variety of different approaches in these different countries, there was a variety of different reactions by the government and security forces. Sometimes there were just counter demonstrations and counter marches. Sometimes it was, they infiltrated. They would send people into these groups not only to figure out what they were doing, but also to act as provocateurs who would, when the people were standing and chanting, they would kind of stand in the back of the group and launch a rock at the line of riot police in order to justify the riot police coming forward and smashing people with batons and stuff like that, right? In order to make the protesters look violent and justify crackdowns. In some places you had reform. In Jordan and Iraq you probably had some legitimate political reform where they said, these are some reasonable protests, maybe we should adjust the laws a little bit. And you had some legitimate reforms. There were reform in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, but a lot of people would call them bribes. These are wealthy governments. I think that Saudi Arabia said something like, in response to what looks like there might be some protests here in Saudi Arabia, we'll kind of cut that off by giving a $35 billion package in, people got a little bit nicer cars, or they got this, that, or the other, whatever. So they just gave a whole bunch more money to the population. The population said, that's cool. We wanted a new car. And so, that kind of thing. In some places there were moderate crackdowns. People were arrested. They dispersed crowds. In some places there were severe crackdowns where you would do anything from mass arrests to having someone that's on a tall building in the area that just starts shooting randomly into the crowd. All right? Any wide variety of different things happening in these crackdowns. And in some place you saw regime change where people were either kicked out of power or agreed to leave power, etc. So a wide range of issues. We're going to start taking a look at some of the individual countries. We're going to start with Tunisia. And the reason we're going to start with Tunisia is this is kind of the spark. All right, this is kind of the spark back in December of 2010. These tensions had been bubbling for quite some time, for several years. But we saw this, this mass outbreak of these tensions happening around that time. And it started off in Tunisia, and it started off with a gentleman named Mohammed Bouazizi, I think is somewhat pretty close to his name. And this is a guy who is essentially a vegetable peddler. He sold veggies in the local market. He would get vegetables from the farmers, he would take them down to the market, he would sell his cabbage, and people would buy it and he would feed his family. He was a little bit outspoken. He complained, to the local officials about stuff, and the police had a tendency to come and, pick on people. And he was one that they typically picked out because he was a little bit more vocal than some of the others. And one day they beat him up. Well, first they arrested him and took him in, and then they beat him up. And he was kind of roughed up a little bit, and he went down to the police headquarters or the magistrate or someone down locally and he said, hey, I got beaten up by the police, they're mistreating me, what can I do about this? This is ridiculous, they're not allowing us to live, conditions are terrible. They, the magistrate, the woman who was supposed to be in charge of his complaint, slapped him across the face and told him, basically get the hell out of here. Right? So the next day he went into the public square, maybe it was the same day, I don't know, he went into the public square, and he tried to get as much attention from everybody that was there as possible. Hey, everybody has some stuff to say. And he was talking about it. He says, what am I supposed to do? I'm trying to feed my family. I can't. They're not letting me feed my family. The only thing that I have left to do is to, try and get attention. So he doused himself in gasoline, and he lit a match and lit himself on fire. Right? And this is a practice, this self-immolation, is a practice that's been carried out across the world in different situations. American Indians have used this in protests. Tibetan nuns, Buddhist nuns, and monks have used this in protest to the Chinese. Right? It's been used in various places, and it tells you one thing. At least, it tells me one thing, and that is that people are desperate. They're so desperate that they don't know what to do. The only thing left to them is lighting themselves on fire to try and attract someone's attention to say, hey, things are messed up. We need to do something about this. And this sparked protests. Right? This sparked protests across Tunisia, where you saw the people rise up and start to challenge these, the powers that be. And the president, Ben Ali, that guy, who had been in power for 23 years, after about a month of protest, he gave up. He quit. He left the country. So we have our first revolution taking place. Then it moves to Egypt. Hosni Mubarak had been in power in Egypt for about 40 years, right, or somewhere around that. And he ruled with an iron fist. He was an authoritarian, but he was our authoritarian. Right? He was our guy. And we were okay with that because Egypt occupies a very strategic point. It's the meeting ground between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Right? That land bridge called the Sinai Peninsula. It's pretty important. It's been important for thousands of years. And there's this thing that rips right through there called the Suez Canal. Something like, 10% of all global trade moves through the Suez Canal every day. Right? That's a lot. It's a pretty big deal. Occupies a pretty important spot right here. And it has also one of the largest populations of the Arab world. So a lot of influence here. So in January of 2011, we start seeing mass protests. Tens and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people out in the street clamoring for change in Egypt, saying, we are tired of this, we need a change, this is ridiculous. And it gets pretty intense. Some of you probably watched some of this. Where's Becca? Becca, were we watching this at the hotel at our tournament here, down at the hotel where you all were staying?
Yeah, I remember that down in the lobby.
Kind of crazy. We were watching this unfold on the television. Many of you probably were as well. Right? There's some pretty crazy imagery coming out of this revolution going on in this country. That's a lot of people. The role of the military was pretty interesting in this conflict because the military largely in this conflict sat back because in a lot of these countries there's a difference between the military or the army and the security police. There's a difference between those two things. We might say, yeah, we have the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, but we also have the FBI and state police, right? So we even have a little bit of that separation. In these countries, it's maybe even a little bit more serious in the separation. And sometimes the army and the government are not hand in hand with each other. They both wield different sets of power. And in Egypt, the army has always been very powerful. Now, the army and Mubarak got along pretty well. They were pretty much together on things. So in this conflict, the army largely stepped aside. It was the security police. It was Mubarak's security police who were cracking down and killing people. And the army said, we're going to sit this one out. We're going to see what happens. We're not ready to throw our lot in with either side because the people have a reasonably legitimate complaint and there's millions of them. We're not going to kill them all. So let's hold off and see what happens here a little bit. And because the army in Egypt has a pretty good reputation amongst the Egyptian people. Not all of them, obviously, but amongst a lot of them. And so the army kind of held out to see what would happen. Well, Mubarak was overthrown after about 2 months of time. And then the military took control of the country for about the next year or so. This guy was elected, Mohammed Morsi. Now, Morsi is an interesting figure because he's a leader in the Muslim Brotherhood. For the longest time, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hosni Mubarak were like oil and water. Right? Didn't mix, didn't get along, a lot of animosity. The Muslim Brotherhood is probably the most well-organized political party. Hard to really call it a political party because it transcends national borders, but it is kind of essentially a political party. It's one of the best organized in the Middle East, right? One of the more well organized. So when this place descends into chaos and the government falls apart and Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak loses power, all of a sudden there's, what's going to happen to fill this space? There's a power vacuum that's been created. Who's going to step in and take on leadership? The problem is they held an election. They held an election back in the middle of 2012, and Mohamed Morsi was the what do they call it? The Freedom and Justice Party, was the party that they created out of the Muslim Brotherhood to run for election. Right? And he won barely, something like 51%, 52%, or roughly along those lines. The problem is that the main other person that was running was really just a holdover from the Mubarak regime. It's like the internal minister or some top official in the Mubarak regime who had just been toppled. The people didn't like Mubarak. They didn't like his government. They didn't like his regime. And so you have one person that basically is Mubarak-like versus Mohamed Morsi. A lot of people didn't want to vote for Morsi, but he was the lesser of two evils. Have we ever seen that kind of happen in elections? Maybe in this country, you vote for the lesser of two evils. Right? It happens all the time. So a lot of that happened here too. So he was elected, and then there was a lot of concern. There's a lot of joy. It's like, oh, we won. We got a first democratically elected president. And then over the course of the next year, there's a lot of concern that people are saying he didn't really rule Egypt for Egyptians. He ruled Egypt for the Muslim Brotherhood. He consolidated power. He put all the economic contracts and all of everything like that running down the line toward the Muslim Brotherhood, and consolidated his party's position. And people said, that's not democratic. That's not what you were supposed to do. You're just doing the same thing Mubarak did, just for a different group or a different special interest. And so they rose up again. Millions of people. They had a poll, or they had poll that they had something like a petition. That's the word I'm looking for. They had something like 25 million Egyptians sign a petition. Now, some of those are probably fraudulent, but a lot of them probably aren't, saying we don't want this guy either. And so they rose up in rebellion, and the army this time took it upon themselves to say, hey, Morsi, you either do something about this and come to a resolution, or we're stepping in and deposing you. And he was defiant and said, I am the president. I have been elected for a 4, or maybe it's 5-year term, to be the president. And you don't just get rid of your democratically elected president, because that's not the way democracy works. So he was defiant, and a day or two later, the army moved in and said, you're out. You're out. So there's been lots of discussion in the media, in the Western media, about, do we use the C word? What's the C word? Coup. Is this a coup or is this not a coup? What do y'all think? Let's just take a quick vote. How many of you think this was not a military coup? How many of you think it was a military coup? Brandon, why not?
Last year I took a class about, it was Asian religions, so it was China, Pakistan, India, and kind of covered Egypt. So I just think that the way that the Egyptian military has functioned over time, and how that power has not always directly been under the formalized government, means that it's very hard to contextualize that as a military coup, because the military in that country isn't perceived in a capacity where they would coup somebody. It's like a different entity. It's almost as if it's a part of the government. So in a world where the military has been more stable than the government, why would you ever declare that a military coup? Because all you would do is reify the notion that a formalized government is the only government that is legitimate, and that is just not the case in countries like the Middle East, like Pakistan.
And it's like we talked about just a few minutes ago. In a lot of these countries, you have the government, you have the military, and they're not always the same, right? And a lot of times the army is what really holds the power, and the president is just, a mouthpiece, the titular head of the nation, but it doesn't really wield all that much power. Just like in Iran, right? The supreme leader, the clerics have the power, despite the fact that there's this president that's making all of this noise. Ultimately, President Ahmadinejad or whoever it's been doesn't really have the power. So can you really call it a coup when in reality it's the military or the army in Egypt that's been the power base and the structure of power all along for the past 40 years anyway. Likewise, there's a lot of literature talking about democracy is more than the ballot box. It takes more than the ballot box to create a democracy. Could you call Egypt a functioning democracy? The Egypt that elected that man right there, could you really call it a functioning democracy? Probably not. I mean, if we were to set up a checklist for what creates a functioning democracy, and it was a checklist of 10 things, maybe 2 of them were things that you could check in terms of the Egyptian democratic process. So it's an interesting question, right? It's an interesting question. At the same time, there's a pretty valid argument to say, look, we just had a democratically elected president. The people voted. You don't change the system. You don't learn about democracy by having your first steps be the military deposing a democratically elected leader. It's a tough question and situation.
Couldn't the democracy, like, before he was given that, couldn't it be viewed as a transitional democracy, like we're still establishing a constitution, like how they function, and the military doing that just sends them back to 5 years?
Absolutely. I mean, we think in this country, we have, a constitution's been around for 250 years. And by international standards, that's forever. Even though the United States is a young country, our Constitution's old, right? Relative to most of these other countries that have only been in existence for, since World War II, decolonization period.
It's also the subject of the document that we have. We have the almost confederation, which is like to make sure that's our country.
Exactly. And so we think of it now in terms that it's been so stabilized and ingrained in our society that we couldn't even think about, get rid of the Constitution. No way. In these countries, with every little change, somebody takes the Constitution, trumps it up, and tosses it over their shoulder and says, hey, let's start again. Right? Maybe not that dramatic, but you understand what I'm saying? Right? So, a lot happening here. A couple of major issues that are happening with what is going on right now in Egypt. First of all, you have the military who really wields the power, telling the civilians, we sat back and let you do your thing, but we didn't like the thing that you did, and so now we're stepping back in and saying can't do the thing that you wanted to do because we don't think a lot of you wanted to do it. They voted for you, but not because they really liked you, but because you were the better option of 2 bad options, and you've had a year, and you've shown that you have one interest, and that is consolidation of power for the Muslim Brotherhood. And there's been serious violence against Christians and serious violence against, various minority groups. So they stepped back in and said, no, not going to do it. What has the United States' reaction been to this military coup, if we call it a coup, this deposing of Morsi? What has the United States' reaction been? You know what this is?
Sit back and watch.
Not much.
Hand-wringing. Oh, why'd you have to do that? The United States doesn't know what to do, right? The United States is in a difficult situation because we give over $1 billion of aid to the Egyptian military every year. We've been buying off peace for Israel for the past 40 years, right? Way back in the day, we sat down with Egypt and Israel and we said, hey, can't you all get along? And will you get along if we pay you to get along? And Egypt said, sure. We'll get along if you pay us to get along. And frankly, it benefits them too, because they don't want to be in a constant state of warfare with a neighbor that's militarily superior to them, right? And so all of a sudden, Egypt has this good relationship, and we've been paying a lot of money to make it happen. And Egypt tries to represent our interests in the area. And so people are saying, you got to withhold the aid. You got to pull out the aid. And we're saying, well, we can't really do that because that would interrupt our interests. It'd disturb Israel's interests, and they'd be really upset. It'd create all kinds of conflict. Plus, we're not sure what we want to do here because we really don't understand this place called the Middle East. Just trying to figure out what to do. Uncertain. And also, places changing very rapidly. Hard to know what's the right thing to do in a place that's changing so quickly and so rapidly. So the United States is uncertain. Obama did cancel a big military operations, right? We were supposed to have military ops with them or training And we kind of pulled out of that as one way to say, you can't do it quite like that. You have to be a little bit more open, a little bit more inclusive, a little bit less heavy-handed, that sort of thing. But it's uncertain what to do here. One last thing that I'm going to mention about Egypt. This place right here, called the Sinai Peninsula. It's a big deal. They fought many wars over it already. But one of the big problems is that back in the day, 30 years ago, when they agreed to have peace between Egypt and Israel, part of the agreement was that Israel said, we don't want Egypt having a military presence, a big, strong military presence in the Sinai Peninsula, because that makes us a little bit nervous, because they have on occasion sneak attacked us from the Sinai Peninsula, so we don't want them to be able to build up forces here. But we still have to have a military presence here because there's a lot of militant activity in the Sinai, and we don't want that either. So what do? They created the MFO. Anybody know what the MFO is? Multinational Forces Operation? Multinational Forces, I think it's Operation, I'm not sure. But it's essentially, it's not NATO, it's not the UN. It is an independent organization of forces that are here to basically act as peacekeepers. But it's not a UN peacekeeping operation, or maybe they have some affiliation with the UN, but it's kind of its own thing. When things went crazy, Mubarak was kicked out of power, and Morsi took power, they kind of ignored the Sinai because they were worried about what was going on in Cairo. They had their hands full, which meant it was open season again over here for the militants to train. They started carrying out more attacks in Israel. Eilat has been attacked a couple of times. I was there a couple of days before rockets rained down on this city, and I was like, oh, that's kind of scary. Right? So all of a sudden you have this tension, and Israel likes to see a stable Egypt because it means security on their southern flank. Okay, pretty big deal for them. Also, they like to see a stable Israel because of that little narrow strip, tiny little strip of land about the size of Manhattan Island and about equally densely populated, not quite, but close, Gaza. A lot of people don't understand that Egypt, under Mubarak, helped patrol the Gaza blockade. They helped him in Hamas. Right, so a lot at stake for Israel. We're going to bounce through a couple others very quickly. Yemen. Yemen is a difficult one because they've been involved in all kinds of conflicts. Just to look at that map tells you that there are a number of different issues going on. Al-Qaeda is very active in Yemen, perhaps one of the most active areas in the world for Al-Qaeda. You also have individual provinces that are seeking separation. You also have areas that are affected by civil war. Up in the north, this red area, or sorry, that's not red, orange, a group called the Houthi rebels. They're Shia, or Shiite. Who else is Shiite? Major power in the region. Iran, right? The center of Shia Islam. And they like to cause problems for the Sunnis and for other countries, and in particular just for Arabs, just in general. Because are the Iranians Arabs? Some of them are, but like 9%. Right? They're Persian. So down here, they're supporting the Shia rebels up in the north. The Shia rebels in the north of Yemen over the last 2 years have suddenly got a hold of some pretty heavy weaponry. And so they're fighting. Saudi Arabia's got involved, carried out airstrikes in northern Yemen. So Saudi Arabia and Iran are essentially fighting a proxy war against one another in Yemen. Kind of significant because see that little stretch of water right there that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean? Again, 10% of all maritime trade moving through that little bottleneck. With Somalia, really stable place, on one side, and Yemen on the other. There's a lot of concern about what to do with Yemen. Look at the religious and ethnic composition in Yemen. It's crazy. People all interspersed, all mixed together, with histories with one another. Conflict in Yemen got pretty serious. That dude, Salah, he quit. He had his headquarters bombed. He had, third-degree burns over 70% of his body. He had to go to Saudi Arabia to get help, and then he quit. and his vice president took control. Yemen's cool. And how cool is it? Look at that. That city is called the Manhattan of the desert. Skyscrapers that are 1,000 years old. Trippy. Cool. Anyway, Libya. The prettiest dictator in the world. Muammar Gaddafi. We all know a little bit about this one, right? Is this conflict over? No, it's not. We think it's over. There's still little pockets of fighting going on, and there probably will be quite some time. A little bit of the ethnic groups, not so ethnically diverse in Egypt, mostly because there's this great big thing called the Sahara Desert that not a lot of people live in. Syria. We were going to focus a little bit on Syria. Let me ask you all this question very quickly. Do you think that in upcoming years of doing this, for topics like this, we should block out a 2-hour, we should create a 2-hour block?
Yes.
Rather than 50,
Yeah.
right? All right. Okay. So, Assad, a couple of important things for us to know about. First of all, you all need to take a look at the diversity within Syria. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover this together. You need to take a look into the diversity of Syria, the major groupings where the Alawis are found. The Alawites are an offshoot of Shia Islam. Some people say they're Muslim, some people say they're not. That's a source of tension. There are also Christian pockets. There are also pockets of Druze. And if you don't know what the Druze are, I couldn't possibly explain it to you in the next hour. You just got to read about it and figure it out. It's a hard one to understand. And the rest are Sunni Arabs. Oh, I'm sorry. And pockets of Kurds, which are significant as well. You can see that there are a variety of different... I put a bunch of different maps on here just to give you different representations, to give you an idea of how diverse this conflict or this region is. Right? And as we talked about yesterday, people in this area, their first loyalty is to their tribe, their kinship group. Their second loyalty is to their ethnicity. Their third loyalty is to their religion. Their fourth loyalty is to this thing called the nation that they happen to live in. Nation is not really very important in most of these places and to most of these people. There are other things that come far more quickly. A breakdown of the history. That's kind of the older history, how it started. You all can look at this I'll get it up on the Dropbox and you can take a look at this kind of stuff. But that's where the major fighting has happened. Lots of people dead. It's upwards of over 100,000 people right now. The big question is, what is the world doing about it? Right? What is the world doing about it? What have they done about it? You know, the Syrians are saying, hey, everybody, thanks for watching our massacre. Thanks for watching us get killed on, CNN and doing jack squat about it. You know, you were quick to jump into Libya, but not so much here. Thanks a lot. The Arab League asked Kofi Annan. The Arab League are these Arab countries down here. They asked Kofi Annan as an Arab League / UN mission to go in and try to mediate. He went in for a couple, and Kofi Annan's a cool dude, but he could not solve this problem. He could not negotiate a settlement, broke down, and it failed. So then we had full-on war break out in this region. And there are some regional concerns because Syria is aligned with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah has fought wars with Israel. Iraq, which is not even on this map, but Iran, I'm sorry, I said Iraq, but I meant Iran, clear over here, is supporting Syria, even though Sunni, Shia is kind of a split. But the Alawis, which is what Assad is arguably Shia. And so there's a relationship there. There's also some concern about Turkey getting involved, about attacks happening in Jordan and Iraq. Right? What's another country that's fallen apart over the last 6 months? Again, Iraq. Something like 800 people have been killed in bombings in Iraq over the last 2 months. So it's on the verge of teetering back into full-blown civil war again. Some of the big issues in Syria are that there's a variety of different groups fighting. We're not entirely sure who's who and who's what, who's fighting for what purposes. On the one hand, people say the United States needs to get in there and support the rebels because we've got to stop this humanitarian disaster. Other people are saying we don't know who the rebel groups are. We know that there are groups like the Al-Nusra Front, which are really just, Al-Qaeda. We've gone down that road before, where we supported groups that turned into things like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We don't want to give weapons and power to groups that once they consolidate their internal control will just turn those guns on us or on Israel, our ally. We're just concerned about that. Other people saying, actually, it's because those militant groups are operating in Syria that we need to get in there because the regular old people of Syria are saying, hey, Western world, why have you failed us? Why aren't you here helping us out? And there are these radical organizations that we consider radical organizations that are here willing to give us a hand. And if they're willing to give us a hand, we're going to fight for them. We're going to support them. And so the radicalization of Syria is taking place partly because they have no one else to turn to. What's their other option? Die? Right? So a lot of craziness going on. Also, a brand new, element of all of this is that the Kurdish areas up in the north are starting to join the fight. For the first year and a half, they said, we're not sure, we want to stay out of this, we've been a persecuted minority for too long, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden the situation got chaotic enough and crazy enough that they said, maybe we can take advantage of this chaos too. Because we have allies up in northern Iraq, we have allies down in southeastern Turkey, and so the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, that's fought a civil war with Turkey, has been supporting the Kurdish areas up here, setting up training camps. And Turkey, despite the fact that they want to see Assad go in a bad way, they're not so happy about seeing the PKK setting up training camps in northern Syria and the Kurdish fighters starting to participate in this conflict. Whole lot of craziness going on. In addition, another map just representing how crazy this conflict is and who controls what areas. And it changes on like a weekly basis. You have to follow and keep track of who's in charge of what, who's doing what in these different areas, different groups that are engaged in different battles in different areas, in different places. Get the drift? It's complicated. And the more nuanced you become in your debates about this, the more likely it is you win debates about this because you'll be more nuanced. A lot of maps like that. Different groups that are fighting in different areas. Some other things that are important. The UN just sent a team into Syria to investigate chemical weapons use. The first time that Syria relented to say, okay, I guess the UN weapons inspectors can come to town since we, first of all, limited you to only looking at 2 areas within our country. And second of all, or maybe it's 3 areas, but one of them is controlled by the rebels. And second of all, because it's been, long enough, it's been months and months and months, and we've cleaned the places up. We've taken as much evidence as we can and buried it in the dirt out in the desert where we won't tell you where it's located. And, they think they can cover it up and that kind of stuff. Russia has said, actually, it was the rebels who used the chemical weapons and tried to blame it on the government. Right? Again, as we started off this discussion, allegations and counter-allegations going in every which way, shape, and form. Which ones are accurate, which ones are not? Uncertain. Another thing to think about with the no-fly zone. Problems with the no-fly zone. First of all, it's expensive. Second of all, Syria actually has an air defense system. Libya did not. Well, they did, but it was just a pretty poor one. Syria has one of the better air defense systems in the world because they've been getting regular upgrades from Russia for years and years and years. But one thing that also complicates this is a lot of us think that, Russia has supported them in providing this air support network. But it's not just that they provided the air support network, it's that there are Russians running it. Right? So when you go to the little radar station outside of Latakia, and there's, a few Russians in there that are actually working the dials. It's complicated stuff. And they're just like the United States. They don't like to give away our tech, but they don't like to give away the knowledge of how to run it or fix it or anything like that. And so if a no-fly zone is put in place, that's not just shooting planes. Right? That's one part of shooting the planes. But before you can even shoot the plane, you have to knock out the radar stations, you have to knock out the anti-air batteries, you have to knock out all of those command and control and communication facilities. And guess who some of those are staffed by? Ruskies. All of a sudden it becomes an entirely different situation when we've got to kill Russians in order to do that. Now, but if the United States were to actually implement a no-fly zone, they'd say, hey, Vladimir, we're coming to get your people out. they would probably withdraw. There would be some pretty, wicked behind-the-scenes negotiation going on for a little while, but they'd probably pull out, and then we would carry out a no-fly zone. Problem is, with the no-fly zone, is even if you get Assad out of power, who takes control? Who do you give power to in Syria? Yeah, nobody has an answer to that. Not just in this room, but not at the Arab League, not at the United Nations. Nobody has an answer to that question, which is why we're so hesitant, because as far as Israel has been concerned over the last 30 years, they don't like Bashar al-Assad. They think he's a dick. But he's kept the peace. They'd rather have somebody that they don't like in power that keeps the peace than somebody that they don't like that is willing to go to war with them. It's a messed up situation. It's difficult. It's hard. There aren't any really good answers. You will debate this many, many times over the course of the next year. The way to debate it is to understand the regional tensions, to understand the internal tensions, who's involved and who the different parties are. That's religious parties, or not parties like political parties, but religious organizations, political parties. And when I say political parties, there are hundreds of them. Individual movements, rebel movements, individual ethnic groups, individual linguistic, cultural groups, and how all of them play off one another. Because it's not as simple as, well, there's some rebels fighting the government. There are about 50 different rebel groups fighting the government, and many of those 50 different rebel groups are also fighting each other all the time. And you win debates by knowing about how all of that is happening, which means you got to stay up on it almost every single week. It's hard. You got a debate that's going to be happening in just a few minutes. So.